The emergency room at Ottawa General was the kind of place that didn't offer comfort so much as it offered fluorescent lighting, and the particular sound of a building working very hard to be okay. The nurse who came in for the intake check had kind eyes and the practiced efficiency of someone who had worked night shifts long enough to not let them harden her. She checked the blood pressure cuff, made a note on her tablet, then looked at the man sitting rigid in the chair beside the bed and smiled with the warmth of someone confirming something she already believed about people. "Your husband hasn't moved from that chair since they brought you in," she said softly. 3 hours. You're very lucky to have someone like that." Miles Harwood went completely still. He was not her husband. He was the head of facilities at 340 Rideau Place, the man who had pulled her behind a concrete pillar in the parking garage 40 minutes ago, whose jacket she had bled through on the drive over, whose name she had not learned until she read it off his staff lanyard. He had the correction fully formed, had the sentence already shaped, when Adelaide reached over and closed her fingers around his wrist. Firm, deliberate, the grip of someone who had already made a decision and was not going to revisit it. "I know," Adelaide said to the nurse, her eyes not moving from the woman's face. "That's why he's the only person I trust right now." The nurse smiled, noted something in the chart, and moved on. The door swung shut behind her. Miles waited 4 full seconds, then quietly, "That wasn't an accident." "No," Adelaide said, "it wasn't." She looked at him the way people looked at someone they were about to ask too much of, with full knowledge of what they were doing. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing before we go any further. Stories like this one don't arrive fully assembled. This one is only just getting started. Miles Harwood had worked in buildings long enough to understand that a structure told you everything about itself, if you knew how to listen. Not through what was visible, the polished lobbies, the pressure-tested glass, the LEED certifications framed in the entryway, but through what lived underneath, the sublayer data that building management systems generated and quietly discarded, logs that recorded not just events but patterns, the slow accumulation of ignored alerts that preceded a catastrophic failure. Standard audits never touched these logs. Most facilities software didn't even acknowledge they existed. He had been head of facilities at 340 Rideau Place for 6 years. It was a good building. Not his building, technically, but the kind he ran well enough that people stopped noticing it, which was, in his view, the highest professional achievement available in his field. His son Noah was 9 years old and had recently decided that Tuesdays were the correct day to bring lunch to the building. Not every Tuesday, just the ones where he woke early enough and felt, in the way 9-year-olds felt things, that it needed to happen. He would pack whatever was left from the night before into a container his mother had bought at the Byward Market years ago, and Miles would hear him in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, moving quietly so as not to wake his grandmother. That particular Tuesday, Noah had sat on the storage cabinet in Miles's maintenance office and worked on a school project about migratory birds while Miles ran diagnostics on the second floor's air handling units. They had stayed like that for close to an hour without much conversation, in the easy way they had learned to be together since Rebecca died. When Noah left, he did not show Miles what he'd been drawing in the margins of his notebook. Miles did not ask. Noah had been 6 when Rebecca died. Old enough to understand that she was gone, too young to understand why, and young enough that he had adjusted to a shape of family that did not include her. Sometimes Miles thought that adjustment was the bravest and most heartbreaking thing he had ever watched happen. He had spent 3 years not fully believing the fire marshal's report. The report called it an electrical fault in the mechanical room. It cited an undetected arc flash in the secondary distribution panel. It named no one. It listed no prior service calls to that system, no outstanding safety flags, no indication that anyone had known and looked away. Miles had read the report 14 times. He had worked in buildings for 2 decades. He knew what a maintained system looked like, and he knew what a neglected one looked like, and the building where Rebecca had died, a mixed-use tower in the Glebe that had been managed by Carew Capital for 8 years, had been, in his professional opinion, the second kind for a long time before anyone admitted it. He had begun building the tool in the first year after she died. It was a data extraction program designed to recover deleted or overwritten sublayer logs from building management systems, the kind that recorded not just events but the patterns leading to them, the slow failure that a maintained system would have caught and flagged. He had spent 18 months learning the architecture, writing and rewriting the extraction code, testing it on systems he managed himself so he could verify it was reading correctly. He had never used it on anything that mattered. Not yet. Adelaide Carew had not slept properly in 10 days. She sat in the back of her own car on the way to an 8 o'clock board prep meeting and read the same page of the Rideau portfolio risk summary for the 4th time that week. The numbers were not wrong in any way that would trigger an automated compliance flag. They were wrong in the specific way that told her someone had spent real effort making them look right. The kind of smoothing you performed when you knew what rough looked like and were trying to ensure no one else got close enough to see it. Adelaide had taken over as COO of Carew Capital 2 years ago, after her father's stroke and her mother's death within the same calendar year. She had grown up inside the company the way some children grew up in family restaurants, learning the language of asset yields and occupancy rates before she learned to parallel park, understanding that the company and the family were not separate things but were, at some deep level, the same conversation. Her brother Quentin had been charming through most of it. He was 5 years older and had always moved with the ease of someone who assumed rooms would rearrange themselves to accommodate him. Since their parents had stepped back, he had become something else, something with sharper edges and a longer reach. For the past 5 months, Quentin had been driving the Rideau portfolio sale toward board approval, with a force Adelaide found disproportionate. He had the buyer lined up, the deal structured, the timeline mapped. All he needed was her co-signature as CO, which he treated as an administrative formality rather than an executive decision with weight behind it. She had told him 3 times she was not signing a portfolio transfer with irregular fire suppression maintenance data. He had told her 3 times she was over-indexing on technical details that the buyer's own due diligence would handle. 3 nights ago, she had found a message in her direct inbox from an address she didn't recognize at first, the Glebe Tower. Look at the service records from 2021, before they were filed. She had stared at it for a long time, then closed it without responding. She assumed it was a pressure tactic from someone in Quentin's circle, someone trying to unsettle her into compliance or into making a mistake. She was wrong about that. She wouldn't understand it until later. The parking garage at 340 Rideau Place had 4 levels below ground. The camera feed on the lowest level had been showing a maintenance flag for 11 days. Miles had filed the work order. It had been reassigned 3 times without resolution, each time to a contractor whose dispatch schedule never seemed to include Rideau Place. Adelaide was 40 meters from the elevator bank when she heard footsteps behind her that didn't belong to the space. Not the rhythm of someone who had just parked and was heading in. Something with a different kind of purpose. She had approximately 2 seconds. Miles was doing his walkthrough of P4 when he heard it. Not a scream, she hadn't had time for one. A sound, and then the particular silence that followed something wrong. He moved toward it without deciding to. He was not trained for what came next, but he had spent 2 decades working in environments where staying calm when systems failed was the difference between a contained problem and a catastrophic one. He applied the same reasoning. He dealt with the situation. Adelaide ended up behind him, then behind a concrete support column, then in his car because the ambulance dispatch said 12 minutes, and she was losing blood from a cut above her shoulder blade that looked worse than it was but still needed a hospital. She told him her name on the way, Adelaide Carew. She said it the way someone said their name when they were watching to see if you already knew it. He didn't. She asked if he had somewhere to be. He said no, which was almost true. His mother had Noah for the night. There was nowhere urgent. He stayed at the hospital because she had come in alone and her emergency contact wasn't answering. He told himself it was to give a statement. He gave the statement and kept sitting because the intake desk said she had no family present, and he was not able to make himself leave a person alone after what had happened. At 1:30 in the morning, a doctor he hadn't spoken to yet came out to find him. The conversation that followed was the one that started this story. Miles waited until the door had been closed for a full minute after the nurse left. "Why?" he said, keeping his voice down. Adelaide told him plainly. Whoever had sent someone to the garage tonight also had the building under watch. They would be watching for investigators, security consultants, lawyers, anyone who fit the profile of a threat. A spouse who had been there all night fit none of those profiles. She needed 48 hours with access to the company's internal system from a position no one would look at twice. Someone they wouldn't expect. She offered to pay him. The temperature in the room shifted. "Don't," Miles said. A pause. "I don't know how to ask for help without putting something on the table," she said. "I've been doing it so long I've forgotten the other way." She said it without apology or self-pity, with the same flat honesty she had applied to everything else. He named 3 conditions. Noah stayed entirely out of it. His name, his school, his existence completely separate from whatever this was. She told him the truth about every risk, including the ones she wasn't certain of. And the moment they had real evidence, it went directly to the police. No negotiation, no delay. She agreed to all 3 without hesitation. 2 hours later, Quentin arrived at the hospital with a communications associate and a man Miles read immediately as a lawyer. He was composed in the way that indicated the composure was deliberate. He stood in the doorway and looked at Miles with the polished neutrality of someone trained to give nothing away on first impression. Adelaide looked at Quentin the way you looked at someone you had already begun grieving before they were gone. "This is Miles," she said, "my husband." Miles did not look away from Quentin. He understood in that moment that something had changed. He was no longer the man who had happened to be in the wrong garage at the right moment. He was now the person standing closest to Adelaide Carew, which meant he was standing directly between Quentin and whatever Quentin still needed to take from her. He also understood that the documents she had asked him to carry in his inside jacket pocket were no longer just sensitive files. They were the reasons Quentin's associate had already glanced at that jacket twice. The safe house was a stone farmhouse the Carew family had owned for 40 years, 40 minutes east of the city near the Rideau River. Adelaide walked through it when they arrived, checking what her parents had kept and what had changed, cataloging the rooms the way a person cataloged a house after a flood, noting what was still standing. Miles set his laptop on the kitchen table and opened the extraction program. He explained what it did in the same flat voice he used to explain maintenance issues to building owners. He described the sublayer logging architecture. He explained that the data it recovered was the kind that standard audits never reached, the pattern of small suppressions that preceded a large failure. Adelaide looked at him carefully. "Where did you learn to build something like this?" "After my wife died," he said. "I needed something to do with the time." He told her about Rebecca. Not everything, just the parts that bore on what they were doing. The way she had flagged an anomaly in a building management system 2 weeks before she died. The way she had called him from a site visit to say something felt wrong about a secondary distribution panel. The same one the fire marshal would later cite as the source of the arc flash. The way he had told her to log it and he'd take a look that weekend. The weekend hadn't come. "Which building?" Adelaide said. He told her. She went very still. "That property was under Quentin's asset management division," she said carefully, weighing each word against something she already knew. "I was managing acquisitions at the time. I had no visibility into the individual maintenance programs." She stopped. "I know that doesn't change anything." "No," Miles said, "it doesn't." The silence between them was not a comfortable one and was not meant to be. Miles sat with the specific fact that the company whose letterhead was on the documents in his jacket was the same company whose records might contain the reason Rebecca had died. He did not try to resolve it, because it was not the kind of thing that resolved. He just stayed with it. He ran the extraction program against the archived BMS data Adelaide pulled from the company's internal server. It took 19 minutes to find what he was looking for. Rebecca's name was not in the file, but the building address was, and the log showed 14 months of overridden sensor alerts, logged at the sublayer level and suppressed before they reached the standard reporting dashboard. Someone had known the system was failing. The user ID associated with every suppressed flag belonged to a maintenance contractor whose service contract had been administered directly through Quentin's division. Miles sat back from the screen. "He knew," Miles said. "He knew," Adelaide said. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The message came through a personal channel Miles didn't recognize, an encrypted direct message from a username that meant nothing until Adelaide cross-referenced it against the company directory. Arthur Venn, Carew Capital's chief compliance officer, a careful and methodical man in his early 60s who had been with the company since Adelaide's parents had run it. He wrote that he had a file, maintained offline for 3 years, containing the original maintenance records for 11 Carew Capital properties. records that had been removed from the active database and replaced with amended versions. He had been collecting them since he first noticed the discrepancies. He hadn't come forward because Quentin would have had him removed before the information reached anyone with authority to act on it. He needed someone to receive the file. He asked to meet them on the building's archive level after hours. There was no clean way to enter as themselves. They went in as what they were supposed to be, Adelaide's hand in the crook of Miles's arm, unhurried, unremarkable. Adelaide moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 20 years navigating rooms where she was being watched. Miles moved the way he always moved, directly, without performance. When they crossed under the lobby camera, she stepped closer. He registered the shift in her weight without looking at her. He noticed that her hand against his sleeve was not entirely steady. He noticed that her face showed nothing at all. They were 30 feet from where Arthur was supposed to be standing when the fire door ahead opened and every light in the sublevel went out at once. Not a fuse. The entire level, simultaneous. Emergency strips along the floor stuttered to life in thin orange lines. Miles had Adelaide behind a shelving unit before the decision had fully processed. He had spent 20 years in buildings. He knew what deliberate darkness felt like. There was one man. Miles dealt with it in the space between the shelving rows, not cleanly, with a cost he'd assess later when the adrenaline finished, and in the process he got the man's phone. He looked at the screen, a text from an unsaved number. "She's not alone. Deal with both of them. Don't let the husband leave the building." Miles read it twice. He was not the husband. He had held the role for 36 hours and had agreed to it for 48. But whoever was sending these instructions believed he was the person Adelaide trusted most, which made him the most direct threat to whatever Quentin was protecting. The role he had taken as cover had become the reason someone wanted him in a basement with no cameras. Arthur had seen what was happening and pulled back. He sent a message 2 minutes later. "Files are safe. I'll find another way to get them out." They waited in a utility room off the back stairwell until it was clear, door locked, lights off. The professional composure Adelaide had rebuilt since the hospital was gone. She was just a person sitting on a cold concrete floor in the dark, very tired, not performing anything for anyone. She said that after her parents died, Quentin had been the one constant. She had believed it was loyalty. She understood now that it was positioning, that he had been the only person she thought she still had left, and learning that he had arranged for someone to solve the problem of her in a parking garage didn't just feel like betrayal. It felt like losing her parents a second time. Miles was quiet for a moment. Then he told her about the weekend he hadn't gotten to. The client call on a Friday afternoon, the problem that needed eyes on site, the yes he had given because he always gave it. The way he had spent 3 years deciding that his last conversation with Rebecca, "I'll look at it this weekend," was the sentence that had killed her. Adelaide turned to look at him in the dark. She didn't rush it. After a moment, she said, "The person who suppressed those alerts is responsible for what happened to Rebecca, not the man who was doing his job and trusted that the system would catch what it was supposed to catch." She said it with the flat precision she used when correcting a factual error rather than offering comfort. "She knew you were coming home. That's not a failure. That's just a Friday." It was not a grand statement. It didn't rearrange what had happened. But something in the way she said it, plainly without sentiment, like a conclusion that had simply been reached, settled into a part of him that had refused to hear it in any other form. He breathed out slowly. They sat together for a while after that, in a silence that was not the uncomfortable kind. Quentin called an emergency board meeting for the following morning. He framed it as a governance matter. Adelaide's judgment since the incident, the sudden appearance of an undisclosed husband, decisions made outside proper process. If the board voted with him, the Rideau portfolio sale advanced to final approval under interim authority, which meant Quentin. Miles told her he didn't think she should go. The building was compromised. Walking into a boardroom that Quentin had been cultivating for months was not a controlled environment. He reminded her that their agreement had been 48 hours. Adelaide asked if he wanted to leave because the arrangement was finished or because he was afraid of what was forming between them. He didn't answer. His phone rang. Noah's voice was the most ordinary sound he had heard in 2 days. Noah wasn't calling about anything he'd seen or heard. He just said, "Dad, are you coming home for dinner?" Gran made chicken soup. That was the whole question. And something shifted in Miles's chest in a way he hadn't expected. because Noah had asked him that same question every evening since Rebecca died. Not because he cared about the menu, but because he needed to know Miles was coming back. That particular need, asked in that particular voice, on an ordinary evening. Miles told him he'd be late, told him to eat without him, told him he loved him, and Noah said I know and hung up. He called his mother, gave her an address 2 towns east, told her to take Noah there tonight and not mention where they were going to anyone. His mother asked one question, "Are you safe?" He said yes. She said okay. He went back to find Adelaide. She was standing at the window with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder. Before he could speak, she said, "I'm not going to let Noah lose another father." Miles looked at her for a moment. "Then don't make him watch me lose you." He reached for his jacket from the chair by the window. As he pulled it on, his hand caught something in the inside breast pocket. A folded piece of paper, small and precisely creased, tucked in with the particular care that only one person in his life applied to things done quietly and without announcement. He pulled it out. It was a page torn clean from Noah's project notebook, a drawing in pencil, 3 figures standing in front of a house, the small one in the middle. The figure on the left was wearing what looked like a work vest. The figure on the right had long hair, sketched in careful loops. Miles stood by the window and looked at it for a long moment. He did not ask himself who the third figure was. He folded the page back along its original crease and moved it to his shirt pocket, closer in. "Let's go," he said. The boardroom on the 14th floor held 18 people, most of whom Quentin had been building relationships with for months. Miles set his laptop on the table without preamble and opened the extraction program's output on the room's display screen. He explained what it was, what it read, and where the data had come from. He used plain language. He did not raise his voice. He pulled up the suppressed maintenance logs. He pulled up the user ID patterns. He pulled up the timeline showing 14 months of overridden sensor alerts at the Glebe Tower, every suppression traceable to the same contractor, every contractor invoice payable through a numbered company registered at an address belonging to Quentin's personal holding trust. Arthur Venn arrived 11 minutes in. He opened a folder and set it on the table. What it contained was 3 years of documentation, 11 properties, 42 incidents, 16 fatalities, all attributed to electrical faults or tenant negligence in the official records, all involving buildings where the maintenance data had subsequently been amended in the company database. Rebecca's name was not in the file, but her building's address was on page 4, and the pattern surrounding it was identical to every other entry. Miles looked at the page for a long time without speaking. Adelaide called for building security. Quentin, who had been listening from the far end of the table with the composure of a man who had prepared for many contingencies, stood and spoke first. He said Adelaide had not been herself since the incident. He said the data had been compiled by a facilities worker with a personal grievance against the company. He said the board had a duty of care to its assets and its shareholders, and that the materials on the screen were not what they were being presented as. He was thorough. He had clearly rehearsed it. He had managed the board for years. He had also, Adelaide had discovered the previous evening, quietly replaced the overnight security supervisor 3 days ago with someone who reported to his personal assistant. The security team moved toward Miles and toward Arthur. What Quentin had not managed was the secondary file Arthur had sent, before retreating from the sub-basement, to 3 separate addresses simultaneously. The Ontario Securities Commission, a federal building safety investigator who had been attempting to access Carew Capital's inspection records for 14 months, and a journalist at a national outlet who had been receiving corporate non-answers to safety questions for 2 years, and had been waiting for something exactly like this. Miles had also, in the 90 seconds Quentin spent explaining his logic to the boardroom, believing he had already won, recorded everything on his phone and pushed the file to the encrypted account number Arthur had sent him 2 days prior. The phone had vibrated once, confirmation received. When police arrived at the 14th floor, they had the maintenance records, the financial trail, and the audio. They had enough that Miles did not need to explain anything twice. Quentin was walked out through the building lobby. He said nothing. He had the expression of a man who had arrived at a possibility he had once considered and dismissed as unlikely. The formal accounting took months. 42 incidents were reviewed. 16 fatalities were reclassified. The families were contacted individually by a team Adelaide assembled and supervised herself. She did not delegate the language of those letters. She wrote everyone. Rebecca Harwood's death was formally reclassified on a Wednesday afternoon. Miles received the notification on his phone in the school pickup line, engine running, radio off. The new finding was 4 sentences. The fire had been caused by a known and suppressed fault in the building's secondary distribution system. The failure had been deliberately concealed from regulatory oversight. The on-site safety technician had identified the fault and had not been negligent. The on-site safety technician had not been at fault in any respect. He read it twice. He set his phone face down on the passenger seat and sat with what was in his chest for a while, in the quiet of the idling car before the school doors opened. Adelaide gave a public statement that did not minimize what the company had done. She did not frame it as Quentin's crime alone. She said the structure had allowed it, the hierarchy, the separation between divisions, the approval culture that had kept the right questions from reaching the people with authority to act on them, and that dismantling that structure was her responsibility, not a reputational exercise. She established an independent building safety fund with an external board and brought in 3 outside organizations to audit every active Carew capital project. The Rideau portfolio sale was suspended without a reinstatement date. When a reporter asked about Miles, about the husband who turned out not to be a husband, Adelaide answered without hesitation. She said he was not her husband. She said he was the man who had stepped between her and serious harm before he knew her last name, who had stayed through the night in a hospital because she had no one else there, who had built a data recovery tool in his own time over 3 years of grief and used it to recover evidence that 16 families had been owed for a long time. She said the company owed him something it couldn't repay. She said she was going to try anyway. Miles went back to the building. He dropped Noah at school on a Thursday morning and listened to him explain with impressive focus why the Arctic tern completed the longest migration of any living creature on Earth, pole to pole, every year without stopping. He dropped Noah off, drove to 340 Rideau Place, rolled up his office door, and stood looking at the corner of the desk where the extraction program had been running in test cycles for 3 years. He closed the laptop. That felt like the right thing to do with it. He was checking a pressure reading on the 4th floor when Adelaide's car pulled into the garage. She was alone. She walked to his office with the same directness she brought to everything and set a folder on his desk. Inside was the reclassified incident report for Rebecca and a handwritten letter on plain paper, 3 pages in her actual handwriting. "I'm not here to ask you for anything," she said. "I'm not going to ask you to join the fund or the restructuring or any of it." Miles set down his pressure gauge. He told her that when he had been sitting at the boardroom table with Quentin's security team moving toward him and the program output on the screen, he had run through the outcomes clearly. He had been fully aware of what the wrong outcome would mean. And in the middle of that, he had had a thought that had nothing to do with the evidence. A thought about something he hadn't said to her. Something he should have said when they were sitting on the concrete floor in the dark. And that if it went wrong, he would not get the chance. He said he had stayed through all of it not because of the plan or the arrangement, not even entirely because of Rebecca, though he had needed that more than he had words for. He had stayed because somewhere in the past 4 days he had stopped thinking of Adelaide as the person he was protecting and started thinking of her as the person he did not want to lose. He hadn't felt that since Rebecca. He didn't fully know what to do with it, but he was not going to pretend it wasn't there. He said it the way he said everything, measured plain, directly off the surface of what was true. Adelaide was quiet for a moment, then, "Are you frightened?" "Yes." "Do you want to try anyway?" He looked at her. "That's why I'm still standing here." 4 months later, Adelaide established an independent building safety certification center, separate from Carew Capital, with an external board and full override authority on any project that failed to meet standard. She asked Miles to hold that authority. He accepted on one condition: the center would carry the names of the 16 people who had died, not in a footnote, on the entrance of the building at eye level in full. She agreed without negotiating. Noah took his time. He was not a child who was managed or hurried. He observed things carefully and came to his own conclusions when he was ready. He watched Adelaide for weeks before he brought out the photograph from the shelf above his desk, him and Miles and Rebecca at a conservation area north of the city, the summer before she died. "Was she funny?" Noah asked. Adelaide looked at the photograph for a long moment. She looks like she was, she said. And your dad still carries her with him. You can see it in how he works. Noah looked at the photograph. Then he set it back on the shelf and picked up his jacket because they were going to the market, and he was hungry. And Miles had been promising maple taffy from the man at the East End stall for 2 weeks now, and he intended to collect. He didn't ask any more questions about it that afternoon. But after that day, he stopped sitting still when Adelaide came over. He started showing her things. His migration project, a rock he had found near the Rideau River, a puzzle he had abandoned and decided he wanted to finish. Small things offered without ceremony. That was the whole thing, just that. The follow-up appointment was 6 weeks after discharge. The same nurse was on, same floor, same shift. She recognized them both before they reached the desk and looked at Miles with the warmth of someone who felt they had been present at the beginning of something and was glad to see where it had gone. "So what do I call him today?" she said, smiling. "The man who saved your life or the world's most patient husband?" Miles opened his mouth. Adelaide looked at him, direct, clear, the kind of look she used when she meant exactly what she was about to say. "Not my husband yet," she said. "But he's the man I love and the only person I want to build something lasting with." Miles said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a key. Brass, worn at the edges, cut for the front door of the house he had been quietly renovating for the past year. The one with the extra room he had framed and drywalled and then simply stopped because he hadn't known what it was for. He set it on the counter in front of her. "No arrangement," he said. "No conditions, just a door that's been waiting for someone to decide what it belongs to." Adelaide picked up the key. She turned it once in her palm. Then she took his hand, firmly, deliberately, with full intention. This time there was no one to perform it for, no threat watching, no role being maintained. It was just 2 people in a hospital corridor on an unremarkable Ottawa afternoon, holding on. The misunderstanding that had started it all, "Your husband hasn't left your side," had turned out to be the only true thing said in that room. It had simply arrived a few months ahead of schedule. Miles didn't stay beside Adelaide because of what she represented or what she could offer. He stayed because a person was alone and had been hurt, and he was the kind of person who moved toward that rather than away from it. And in doing so, he found something he had stopped expecting to find. That's what this channel is about. Ordinary people, extraordinary moments, and the lives that change quietly because someone chose to stay. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We'll see you in the next one.